you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little black subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that black subscribe button. Really does help our audience grow, really does help our channel grow, really does help and mean more than you could possibly know. So go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Also, thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet 50 on any game, get $250 in free bets. Thank you again to Betfred. Thank you again to you. Now, here is the video that you came here for. Switch gears, and I actually want to talk a little bit of college football. So it's been a quiet few weeks in the world of college football. But what I would say, college football is coming, man. We're about 3.5 weeks away from SEC Media Days. And then from there, it's obviously going to be go time. We're going to get into fall camp stuff, into preseason stuff, into game stuff. And before you know it, it's going to be October 11th, and we're going to be wondering where the whole season went. But I bring it up because we actually got a little piece of news this week from, frankly, the loudest, most important voice in college football. That voice is Nick Saban. Had something very interesting to say about the college football playoff, but also something that I would argue kind of made him look a little bit petty and a little bit of a sore loser going forward. So I want to share that. I want to share some context behind the quotes. But first, let me say this. I generally think that Nick Saban is good for college football. I generally think that when he says, is this what we want college football to be? 99% of the time, he really does care about the health of the sport. But again, this week he said something that I just vehemently think that was just sad and kind of lame on Nick Saban's behalf. So let's get into the quotes. And before we do, a little bit of context behind what he said. If you remember last year, really the quotes from Monday really go back to last year. And if you remember last year was by Alabama standards, quite frankly, a little bit of a disappointing season. Go back to last season, Alabama preseason #1 team, reigning Heisman Trophy winner Bryce Young. Many, including myself, thought it had a chance to be one of the great Alabama teams of all time. Instead, they lose at Tennessee, they lose at LSU, and finish the regular season at 10-2 overall. Going into the final weekend, they weren't even part of championship weekend as LSU won the SEC West. And as the playoff picture started to unfold with the 4-team playoff last winter and last fall, if you remember, there were really 5 teams for the 4 spots in the college football playoff. Georgia was a lot going into the final weekend, and then, of course, they won the SEC championship game and got the #1 overall seed. Michigan was a lock after they beat Ohio State in the final week of the regular season. They win the Big Ten championship. They get the #2 seed. Why I bring it up? The final 2 spots went down to 3 teams. One was TCU, which, if you remember, went into the Big 12 championship game undefeated, then lost in the Big 12 championship game. Then you had Ohio State, which was 11-1, but lost the biggest game of their season at home to Michigan. And then you had Alabama on the outside at probably number 5 in that equation. It ended up certainly being number 5 at 10-2 overall. Yet on that final night, it was very interesting because Nick Saban went on TV that night and essentially, did what he's supposed to do as the head coach. I'm not going to criticize him for this, but he went on the Big Ten championship game broadcast, and Gus Johnson and Joel Klatt kind of asked him, like, hey, do you guys think you should be one of the 4 best teams? Do you think you deserve to be in this college football playoff? And Nick Saban gave kind of a wild answer to that question. If you remember, Nick Saban starts kind of going through and he says, well, let me tell you this. If we just went by Vegas odds, we would be favored over this team and we would be favored over that team. And we need to be in because if you just go by the odds, we would be favored against anybody. We're one of the 4 best teams. We just don't have the record to prove it. And I remember at the time thinking like, whoa, like Vegas, Nicky parlays over here. When did Nick Saban go from the greatest coach in the history of college football, never having to worry on championship weekend, to all of a sudden now he's a bookmaker in Vegas? What? Sharp Nicky Vegas, Nicky parlays. All of a sudden, all he cares about is Vegas odds. I was blown away and could not believe that was his explanation for why Alabama should be in the college football playoff. I bring it up because essentially he brought up that same point this week with Joel Klatt. And this was the piece of news that I found fascinating and I found honestly kind of lame from Nick Saban. So Nick Saban went on Joel Klatt's podcast. By the way, shout out Joel Klatt. He actually came on this podcast once upon a time many years ago. I think it was like episode 4. We're on episode 7, whatever. But Joel Klatt came on at one point. But I bring it up because Joel Klatt kind of asked Nick Saban kind of about the future of the college football playoff. How should it be determined? All that good stuff. And here was what Nick Saban had to say about the college football playoff as it expands to 12 teams. He said, all we do is take the teams that win the most games at the end of the year and put them in the playoffs. But do we really get the best teams? When they told me that we would be favored against 3 out of the 4 teams that got into the playoff last year, I'm like, why aren't we in the playoffs? If you're going to have parity, you have to have a better way of figuring out who has the best teams, not just because you lose 2 games on the last play of the game. And so let me start by saying this. I actually agree with Nick Saban's fundamental point. As we go to a 12-team playoff, just like in the 4-team playoff, just like, by the way, in the 2-team BCS era, I agree. It can't just be about win-loss record, right? You know, if Coastal Carolina finishes 11-1 in that 12-team playoff era and somehow doesn't get an automatic bid, remember there's going to be 6 automatic bids and 6 at-large bids. Just because Coastal Carolina finishes 11-1 and LSU finishes 9-3 or Tennessee finishes 10-2 doesn't mean that Coastal Carolina needs to be in or is a better team. So fundamentally, I do agree with Nick Saban. But at the same time, what I will also say is this. Nick Saban still, from last year, being caught up on point spreads and we would have been favored and this and that, it is sad. It is pathetic. And I'll just say this. I love Nick Saban, but I think he is dead wrong on this particular topic. Let me explain why. First of all, Nick Saban, for now, obviously 8-9 months, has been on this whole, we deserve to be in because we're favored and we lost 2 games on the final possession of the game. Okay, Nick Saban, you're not necessarily wrong on that. Your 2 losses were to LSU and Tennessee on the final play of the game. And it sucked. And it doesn't mean you had a bad season. Doesn't mean your players are terrible. It doesn't mean anything like that. But to imply that it definitively makes you one of the 4 best teams because you lost 2 games on the final play of the game. Let me ask you this. Coach Saban, I'm talking to you, buddy. I'm here for you. Am I the only one that remembers what happened in the other 10 regular season games? Because it'd be one thing if you lose on the final play of the game to LSU and Tennessee and you beat everybody else by 40. Just one problem. Coach Saban, I actually watched the games, and this is what I remember. I remember you having 3 other games that you actually won on the final possession of the game. There was at Texas. Remember that game? Bryce Young pulling you-know-what out of you-know-where. Miracle play after miracle play sets up a field goal, and you survive at Texas? Because I remember that one. How about the final play at against Texas A&M at home? Texas A&M drives the length of the field. Haynes King rolls to his right, throws to the corner of the end zone. It's batted down. Your defense played it perfectly. Credit to your team. But you won that game on the final play of the game. And then, oh, by the way, Ole Miss, there was a goal line stand in the final 30 seconds for you to survive in Oxford. And so for Nick Saban to imply that, well, I mean, come on, we were one of the 4 best teams. Vegas odds. We lost 2 games on the final play of the game. You did. You also won 3 games on the final possession of the game as well. So just as easily as you could have been 12-0 instead of 10-2, you also could have been 8-4 or even 7-5 last year. Beyond that, Coach Saban, and I love you, Coach Saban, but you're so wrong on this. Beyond that, here's the other thing that needs to be considered. One, I think Vegas odds are really important. But if you're going to imply, well, I mean, we would have been favored over 3 or 4 teams. Well, don't results have to matter? Because if we just went off Vegas odds, then why are we even playing games? Let's just name Georgia the national champion now. Oh, I know why we don't do that. It's because of the whole reason that we love college football. It's because of the reason that 100,000+ fans show up to watch your team every time they take the field at Bryant-Denny Stadium. It's why we have 10, 12, 15 million people watching big-time college football games. It's because we always tune in because we never know what's going to happen. It's because we never know what's going to happen. And think about it. Well, we just need to go off gambling odds. Okay. Well, guess what happens if that's the case? Then again, first of all, let's just not even play the season. But then two, beyond that, TCU doesn't upset Michigan in the playoff. We don't get Georgia and TCU for a national champ. But we can't. Why did TCU and Michigan even play? Because the odds would say that TCU had no chance. Oh, by the way, Michigan shouldn't have even been there because Ohio State was favored against Michigan. Oh, by the way, Alabama was favored at LSU by close to 2 touchdowns. So don't tell me it's all about Vegas odds. The whole point, the reason we play sports, the reason we love sports is because you never know what is going to happen. And that's what makes it so fascinating. And finally, I'll kind of just go back to this last point, the point that I just made a minute ago, which is that, like, look, I love watching Alabama football. I mean, you can't talk college football without Alabama. But I do think I'll even give Coach Saban a little bit of credit. If you want to argue that Vegas odds should even play a role in how we rank teams, how we determine teams, all that good stuff, that's fine. But it should be only a part of how we judge teams. Because at the end of the day, here's my thing. If Nick Saban says, well, the Vegas odds say we're one of the 2 best teams in college football, that's fine. But there was no actual tangible piece of data from on the field last year that actually proves that you were one of those best teams. You know how I know? Because again, I watched the games. You weren't the best team. You didn't have the best record. You didn't win your conference. You didn't even win your division. And by the way, you lost the 2 biggest games on your schedule. So if the argument is we're have to judge based on who is the best teams, there was no tangible piece of data outside of Vegas odds that said that you were one of the 2 best teams. Oh, by the way, if you want to talk about losses on the final play of the game, TCU lost their only game of the regular season, or the only game of their season, on the final play of the game before the playoff as well. So you go through every piece of actual on-the-field data. I'm sorry, Coach Saban. I have zero sympathy for you. I respect Coach Saban. I like Nick Saban, but he is just dead wrong on this. But what I'll also say, very briefly before we wrap this segment, is kind of there is an interesting twist to this, is that one of the reasons that I was not in favor of expansion of the college football playoff, I thought 4 was fine. I don't think we're leaving out teams that are good enough to win the national championship, depending on what you feel about Nick Saban's comments. That Alabama team from last year is the perfect example of actually why I'm against college football playoff expansion. It's because guess what? In a 12-team era, Nick Saban's going to get his wish. That team that underachieved all year, that lost twice to the 2 best teams on the schedule, that could have lost 3 more games, they're going to make the college football playoff in a 12-team era. And all that stuff from the regular season, 12 weeks of disappointment and underachieving, 12 weeks of not living up to expectations, it's not going to matter. And it's so funny, right? Because we hear this all the time. We hear, well, you know, could we have a Florida Atlantic? You know how Florida Atlantic made the Final Four in college basketball? Could we have a Florida Atlantic, a George Mason, a this or that, if we expand the college football playoff? I don't believe we will. You know what I do think we're going to get, though? I think we're going to get underachieving teams in the regular season that get into the playoff because there's now 8 more spots available. Those are going to be the ones that go on runs. You know the team that's going to go on the run? It's not going to be the 11-1 Boise State team, okay? Not in football. We saw Cincinnati as an undefeated AAC champ get in the playoff. It was over on 1 possession against Alabama. But at the same time, you put that Alabama team in as a 2-loss team a year ago, as Nick Saban said, they're going to be favored, and that's why I'm not in favor of it. Because everything that you do all year should matter, and it does matter in the current landscape of college football. Now, you can take that 2nd loss. You can take that 3rd loss, and ultimately, it will not matter.